Welcome, welcome, welcome to another edition of Wealth Strategies Unleashed. I'm Robert Gilliland.
And I'm Mike Alexander.
Hey, thank you to everyone for joining us. Hey, Mike, uh, I had something really crazy go and happen last week when I was talking to a potential client, and obviously we get the question, "Do I have enough to be able to retire?" But this person's question was, "Am I saving too much? Am I putting too much into savings?" And so, one of the things I thought we could maybe go through and do and is kind of, and I'll kind of take this first part right here and have you kind of jump in, is that the first thing is determining, do you have enough in what your nest egg is, and are you doing it the right way? And so it seems pretty basic, right? We would obviously recommend work with a planner who's familiar with it. You got to take into account longevity risk, not just deterministic planning, meaning the markets go up every single year, but really look more along the lines of probabilistic. What are your odds of success? As what we said in one of our past podcasts, throw out the 4% rule and look at it from cash flow. You got to pay attention to inflation. You got to take best guesses with taxes. But what would you go and say with regard to how should people go about determining, is your nest egg the right amount?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's probably a question that every investor asks themselves is, how much am I supposed to have? I always err on the side of caution and say it's better to have too much than to not have enough. It simply revolves around the fact that once you retire, the odds of going back to work diminish over a period of time. And so I think the easiest answer to the question is it's better to have too much than not enough. But I think more importantly, it depends on what it is that you want to do in retirement. And
Mm,
so I think you can think of it as what are my fixed costs, and then what are the costs or the spending that I have that might be discretionary. Now, what they always taught us in terms of just investments 101 is that the number one determinant of investment success is actually spending policy. And so the more of your expenses that you have that are discretionary, meaning you can spend as you need, or you can actually dial back some of your spending, the more power, the more control you actually have over that process.
yeah, as Jocko Willink says in his podcast all the time, and is in his book Extreme Ownership, discipline equals freedom, right? I do think it does make a really good point, and that is stop, figure out exactly what you have, figure out exactly what those goals and what needs to happen, and try to assign a value to it. Uh, uh, Sometimes it's kind of like being too funny. There's an old country song that says you can be too good looking and too funny. Those are two things, and also have too much money. It all depends on what those goals are. If you're wanting a legacy, leave a legacy, and things like that, that makes. But what are some negatives of saving too much?
Well, clearly, you pay for that, if you will, in terms of what your lifestyle and retirement
Right,
is.
right.
And so I think we all want to kind of have a good understanding of how long do we have? How long do we have, where we're actually healthy enough to do some of the things that we want to do in retirement. And so in some respects, a lot of folks might wind up actually not spending as much as perhaps they should. And a big part of that, Robert, has to do with just fear. There's always this fear of outliving and outliving your assets, if you will, and then having to rely on someone else. And it's one of the biggest fears that most people have. And it's one of those things that, again, it's just an unknown. You try to plan the best you can for. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why, people come to us, and that, that people need to have some planning process that's actually in place, because I think it's one of those things that you tend to look at every single year when you're doing your review to say, all right, Another year has passed.
Right.
Here's where I am. Here's where I am financially. Here's where I am in terms of health. Here's where my family is. And here's what I anticipate my needs to be over the next year and maybe over the next 3 years, the next 5 years. And I think that's kind of part of that, that planning approach that suits investors really well.
I kind of go through and I think about this because this is something I'm going through with my father, and that is um, once you get into retirement, sometimes spending that money becomes difficult, right? And in the case of my father, he is a person who has this box is for this, and this box is for that, and this box is for that, and I can't maneuver funds any other way. And I've got this goal of what I want to do with this, and you're not allowed to get into the other box. And I think it's really about the relationship to money. And the thing that I tell people all the time, and we've heard the phrase that a Hertz doesn't is not followed by a, was it a Wells Fargo truck or a Brinks truck, right? Life is for living.
Mhm.
And where that success comes in is by being able to plan, understand what it is, know that you have everything in place, and be able to go through to keep score. The other thing that we bump into often is that people kind of have a situation where they realize that there's a shortfall. That, hey, look, and the reality is planning in advance. You don't want that shortfall at age 80, because then you're forced to make decisions that you really don't want to or shouldn't have to make, right? So when you go through to think about, you got to be well in advance before, oops, if I keep spending like this, I'm all, what are kind of some warning signs?
Yeah, warning signs are situations where, as you know, Robert, a lot of times expenses don't, they don't come systematically at a regular figure, if you will. And so they tend to kind of hit you in large increments. Sometimes it's healthcare. Sometimes it's, we run into this in Texas a lot where, you have a storm that hits your house and you're responsible for a 2% deductible and it just hits you big. You have a car that breaks down or needs to be replaced. So there's a lot of different types of things that can hit you. And one of the telltale signs of a shortfall is when you're actually having to liquidate assets, maybe at a price you don't want to liquidate them to cover an unintended, expense or
Right,
something
right.
that you really weren't planning for.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about the planning, making sure, and it's not just I'm getting ready to retire next month, so I go sit down and do a plan and everything looks great, and never review and look at that plan. You've got to continue to go through to keep score. Two things that are big barriers to determining exactly whether you have too much or not enough. One of them is inflation, and the other is healthcare. When we sit down with people in healthcare, meaning longevity, have to think, and maybe I'm thinking faster than I'm talking today.
But I thought inflation was transitory.
Yeah, well, at some points that may or may not be true. So when you go through and you look, right, let's talk about inflation, right? Sometimes people misgauge the real cost of inflation when you're looking out 20, 30 years in retirement. What do you think the best advice is for making sure you're taking that into account?
So, as you and I always, joke about, there's only inflation in the things that I'm buying on a regular basis, but apparently that is not necessarily always seen in the headline numbers. So, but here's a couple of things that we do know. Just in terms of inflation, we know that healthcare is an area that's experienced inflation for a number of years, and it doesn't appear to be one of those things that's going away. That the demand for healthcare just continues to increase, and with longevity comes more healthcare, right? So we know it exists in areas like that. It exists in other places as well, but I think for retirees, I think that's one of the things that they tend to think about most. They might be thinking about inflation and things like travel and leisure as well. And you see it in places like that as well. I think you just have to recognize that, costs are going to average. They're probably going to go up 3 to 5% in some of these areas on an annual basis. And you're going to have years where perhaps they go up a little bit more. So kind of to your earlier point, it depends on what you want to do in retirement. I don't think anyone wants to be spending a lot of money on healthcare or the rising costs of that. I think they would much rather think of the travel and leisure
Right.
and those types of things. So I think the idea is that you just have to recognize that it's going to cost more in 3 years than it costs today. It's going to cost more in 10 years than it costs today. And so I think as it relates to investing for it or saving for it, is that you just want to plan on, you can use that old rule of 72, if you will, and just figure that, if costs are going up, at 7% or 8% a year, it's going in the next 8 or 9 years, the cost is going to double. And so you just have to kind of plan for that and factor it into some of your numbers.
Yeah, the last thing I just would say is on the healthcare. I think that when you're going through and doing your planning, sit down and meet with a lot of people and we ask them, do they have a goal of leaving money to their beneficiaries or to their heirs or to something? That's going to play a big role in healthcare, not the actual healthcare, but in the overall estate. And there are things to do. And what I would argue, knowing that healthcare costs are coming down the pipe, right? That you're probably going to have some added expense inside of there, is have a conversation. And the long-term care policy of your grandpa is probably not the long-term care policy that you want to have today. Things have changed. There's a lot of other things that you can go through and do. Excuse me. So to just kind of wrap this kind of up, I think that the big takeaway that people should have from this conversation is, if you're younger, I don't know there's necessarily a thing as saving too much. You want to make sure that you're saving as much as you possibly can and then a little bit more. Believe me, when I tell my kids that, it drives them crazy. The earlier you get started and the more you save when you get started, the better it will be for down the road when expenses tend to go up because you've got other things in life happening. Building that plan, looking at that probabilistic, what are your probabilities or probabilities of being successful, and making sure that you're continually stress testing that, because markets don't always go up. Would you add anything else?
I would just say, to the degree that you can spend less than your means, I think that's a pretty good recipe for success.
Amen. Discipline equals freedom, as Jocko Willink would say.
Absolutely.
Hey, Mike, thanks for joining me. And to everyone, thanks for listening to this podcast. Hope you found some value, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks.
Appreciate it. See you next time.
The information contained herein is intended to be used for educational purposes only and is not exhaustive. Diversification and/or any strategy that may be discussed does not guarantee against investable losses, but are intended to help manage risk and return. If applicable, historical discussions and/or opinions are not predictive of future events. The content is presented in good faith and has been drawn from sources believable to be reliable. The content is not intended to be legal, tax, or financial advice. Please consult a legal, tax, or financial professional for information specific to your individual situation.
This work is powered by Concenture Wealth Management, registered representative of Sanctuary Securities, Inc., an investment advisor of Sanctuary Advisors, LLC. Securities offered through Sanctuary Securities, Inc., member FINRA, SIPC. Advisor services offered through Sanctuary Advisors, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Concenture Wealth Management is a DBA of Sanctuary Securities, Inc. and Sanctuary Advisors, LLC.